Okay, so the premise of this course and of my book, any questions on the reading? Okay, so you're supposed to be following along in the reading in the book. And my premise is that visionary creativity, so there's all kinds of creativity. Everybody's creative. Everything is creative. But there's something special going on that I call visionary creativity. And what that is visionary creatives swim in the culture of their day. The things they create manifest their culture and at the same time pull us into the future. And the things they create might be in art, architecture, design, business, technology, science. So Facebook is such a creation. We're not too happy with it right now, but it's, it's very much of its time. So we sort of ramped up looking 2 classes ago at the 19th century and last class at the 20th. So let's look at the 21st century and see some things going on and think about what culture are we in today. And when you think about that, you might not feel related to anything I'm showing. You may be in your culture. And so you might want to express that with your project. What you see is important that's going on. So the 21st century. And I've got a lot of material here that I've pulled together from various lectures I've done. And I'll start with some contemporary art. So I was going to give a lecture on contemporary art, which I don't particularly follow. I mean, I'm aware of what's going on, but in the 1960s, I was really immersed in it and knew a lot of the artists, but that was a long time ago. So the first thing I did was I contacted some colleagues at Pratt, and I said, who's important in contemporary art? And I got 10 suggestions. So, who does not know Richard Serra's work? Everybody knows Richard Serra? So, Richard Serra started doing 8-foot by 8-foot squares of steel 2 inches thick, and he leaned them against each other. And I actually worked with the company that was making that, but then he got much bigger. So these things are humongous. They're made in German shipyards. And then how they get them here, I don't know. But anybody know Eric Fischl? So Eric Fischl's stuff some years ago had a kind of adolescent erotic tension to it. And he sort of explored that. And then I don't know how important people think his work is today. Carol Walker, what's she known for? See if I have it. I don't know if I have it. Maybe it'll come up. But she's a black woman artist who explores racial themes. For a long time, she worked in black paper cutouts, typically depicting scenes from slavery. And then she did a quite prominent piece in a sugar factory that was closing near here in Brooklyn. You know that one. I hope it'll come up. Everybody knows Basquiat. Basquiat was a graffiti artist who graduated to the galleries and became all the rage And his work really became valuable because he died of a heroin overdose. And so there's no more Basquiat. So they are incredibly expensive. This is Ricci Albenda. I wasn't familiar with him, but my colleague suggested him. So then I have a brilliant colleague, John David Ebert. So Ebert and I do a website on movies called cinemadiscourse.com. And I met Ebert when we were both involved with the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Campbell's an important mythologist, died in the 80s. And we were aware that there are very powerful mythological themes in movies that nobody was talking about. Nobody understood them. How many people have seen Apocalypse Now? Oh dear. So one of my fantasies is that we create a, you're welcome to take pictures, but all of these are online. So you can download the PowerPoints. You can have the PowerPoints. They're all on the LMS. But don't hesitate to take pictures. That's fine. Just so everybody knows. And I try to put up recordings of the lecture on YouTube. So you have plenty of ways to dig back into this. Well, anyway, Ebert is the single most brilliant person I know. And he's discovered YouTube. So he has 600 YouTubes up. And what he does is French post-structuralists like Michel Foucault. What the hell is he all about? So he reads all of Foucault, and he does chapter by chapter explaining the books. And he's done that for that cool feminist at Philadelphia College of the Arts, Sexual Persona. Camille Paglia. So there are these books that some of us should read but don't. And instead of reading them, you can watch Ebert's YouTubes. he walks you through each chapter. Anyway, he's into art. He did a book called Art After Metaphysics. So I said to him, who do you think are the most important artists? And these are the four he chose. Christian Boltanski. Now, this is Anish Kapoor. He's Indian. And this is called The Kidney. You can see how big it is from the people here. It's in a park in Chicago, and it's made out of polished, seamless stainless steel. And I work with a company that makes sculpture in stainless steel. We couldn't do this. we bid on it, and we negotiated with Kapoor for a while, but eventually he went with an ironmonger, and they did a beautiful job. But we were involved in the beginning. Maybe everybody knows Damien Hirst. He puts a shark in formaldehyde. And then this is Kiefer, Anselm Kiefer. Very powerful work. There's quite some major pieces in the Philadelphia Museum. Some years ago, a head of a British advertising agency put together a collection and then exhibited it. It was called Sensation. And it then got brought to the Brooklyn Museum. And it was huge. Now this is the late 20th century, so we're not quite 21st century. But this is the kind of stuff still going on. So here's another Damien Hirst, sheep in formaldehyde. This is really interesting, House by Rachel Whitehead. What she does is she takes the abandoned house, fills it with plaster, and then removes the house. So just the cast of the inside is remaining. This was a very controversial piece. This is Myra by Marcus Harvey, and she murdered a couple of small children that she kidnapped from a shopping center in England. So this is a despised killer being portrayed here. This is by Chris Ofili, an African painter, and it's a black virgin, and it too was very controversial. Here's an artist who just had a major show at MoMA. This is some of her earlier work, Cindy Sherman. Anybody know what we're looking at here?
They're movie stills.
Right, they're black and white stills from movies that do not exist. And everybody you see here is Cindy Sherman. So she makes herself up and then poses for a photograph that would be like a still from a movie. And you can sort of, here's a movie about an abused woman. There's a black eye. There's a seductive housewife. But it's all Cindy Sherman. And here's the Kara Walker that we saw earlier. So here's our black mama. It's made out of sugar. And it was in a sugar factory that was going to be torn down or converted or something like that in Brooklyn. And then here's some of her slave images. Now, if we're looking at this kind of, I don't know, I'm going to use some negative words here. Exploitively popular art, who's our hero? Jeff Koons. So Jeff Koons is an a stockbroker. And his art is totally calculated. Early on, he did a famous piece. He took a photograph and made it into a sculpture. He got sued by the photographer successfully, which was a really bad decision on the part of the court, because there's a brilliant literary critic, Harold Bloom, and he's once said, there is no poetry, only commentary on other poetry. So you can say, there is no art, only commentary on other art. So let's just drop out of here.
Is this like getting into appropriative art?
Well, but my point is all art is appropriative. In other words, Manet is a reaction against the French classical academic art. Monet grows out of Manet. Cézanne is a rejection of Monet. It's all reference. None of it exists without its being part of ongoing dialogue. But here is, so I'm a kid and I'm, getting into, I'm maybe in junior high and my parents have art books around and, oh, these people used to hang out in the nude in the park. No, there would no more be nude in the park in whatever it is, 1890 than they would be today. But it's artists and their models in the park. So déjeuner, picnic on the grass, picnic in the park, déjeuner sur l'herbe. Now, should Picasso be sued? He's done a dozen of them. And you can go forward to Picasso and more recently, you can go back all the way to Rome of that scene with those two guys and those two models. And if that was illegal, all art would be illegal. In other words, lawyers have shut down art. So any artist anybody who wants to sue you can, because everything you do is derivative because that's how culture is built. James Joyce wrote, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It's about a young man struggling to be an artist, finding his identity, coming of age, and laying down what he's going to do in his artistic career. There are 100 novels that are about that. It's a genre. I forget the name of it. But that's a genre. So it's just a comment on what's Jeff Koons more recently famous for? The balloon dog. So, you know, you blow a party for kids, you have these long balloons, and you stretch them and tie knots in them, right? This is stainless steel. I haven't dared, I worked in, you know, fabricating sculpture, and I've done sculpture. So I'm always want to go up and go, you know, bong it. You know, how thick is it? What's the metal? You can tell a lot. You hit it with your knuckles. But I don't dare touch it because it'll really pick up fingerprints, you can tell. So he just churns stuff out. I mean, there's lots of Jeff Koons stuff. Here, let's just hop on. So you might find some of it familiar.
How did the photographer win the lawsuit?
When?
How?
How?
Yeah.
He said he copied my stuff. And the judge agreed.
Do you know if this was before or after Richard Prince and the Cowboy?
No, tell us about that. I don't know about that.
So Richard Prince, so there was a Marlboro Cowboy advertisement on a billboard, and Richard Prince is a photographer, and he took a picture of it, and he cropped out the Marlboro advertisement, and he published the photo that he took, and it's like
Of the cowboy,
of
and
the cowboy
and the western scene.
and it went for like millions of dollars. And so the photographer like sued him. He's like, "This is my photograph of the cowboy." And so it was just like an advertisement. So like the dude's not being paid as much, and it's not worth as much as Richard Prince, who's selling it for $1 million, I think. And so he sued him, but it's like he, I think, claimed it as like freedom, like art or freedom of press or something like that.
So who won?
I think Richard Prince won, or like they settled something somehow.
Okay. So here's Jeff. If we put Jeff Koons in Google Image, but it's an ongoing problem. These were in a show, a major show of his at the Whitney before. It was one of the last shows at the Whitney before it moved downtown. Now, if you want to look into it, I won't show you, but there's some flat-out pornography that he did. And one of them was a billboard in L.A. He was married to Cicciolina, Italian porn star and member of parliament. Look it up. I won't put up the images.
Wait, his wife was a member of parliament and a porn star?
Right. The Italians have a sense of humor. Well, this is showing a lot of dogs. This is a hedge, a topiary, made out of flowers. Okay, here's Damien Hirst. And he puts these sharks, cows. Oh, and they tend to be sliced. There's a cow cut down the middle in half in formaldehyde in a big tank. And it's risky for the collector because it'll eventually deteriorate. And just as to make a point, see if I can get my arrow. I can't get it. Okay. This is meant to be the most expensive work of art, 100 million. So he made a platinum skull with $30 million worth of diamonds and put it on the market for $100 million. It didn't sell outright. So somebody arranged a deal for it, but he didn't sell it flat out. Now, right down the hall is the undergraduate offices for School of Architecture. So the woman who was in charge of student affairs, she did recruiting, admissions. So Lauder, who's a cosmetic company billionaire, opened a museum, put a beautiful little townhouse on Fifth Avenue on Museum Mile, and it's German and Austrian art, turn of the century German and Austrian art, and you can get pastries and Austrian coffee. For publicity, he bought a Klimt for the most, at that time, the most amount of money ever spent for a painting. And the person selling it said, "Don't you want a bargain?" He says, "No, I want the price higher because I'm buying it for the press publicity." So, oh my God, the museum has the most expensive painting ever bought until the next one. So it's a beautiful Klimt. So that's some contemporary art, and we'll think about what does that mean. So some contemporary architecture. So both modern and postmodern architecture were ideological. So when Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe was promoting that glass and steel modern architecture, white boxes in the 1920s, this is Saint-Didier, wonderful architect. And he made these drawings. There's about a dozen of them, and he died in World War I at a young age. So there aren't any more. In the Futurist Manifesto, Saint-Didier and Marinetti, who's the futurist poet, the futurist house must be like an enormous machine. Le Corbusier, a great modern architect, wrote, you know what? This is running off of here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me get out of there. When I move these slides, they jump to 24 point. Let me get back to 18 point. Let's go to 16. There we go. So we affectionately call Le Corbusier, we architects call him Corbu. If we eliminate from our hearts and minds all dead concepts in regard to the house, we shall arrive at the house machine, the mass-produced house, healthy and morally so too, and beautiful, Le Corbusier. So these modern architects were promoting a new vision, not just, oh, we can make a house more economical, but it will launch a new moral human being. So they really had a revolutionary attitude in mind. Adolf Loos, the evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament. Freedom from ornament is a sign of spiritual strength. So anybody know the title of his famous essay? Ornament is Crime. And it begins with primitive people tattoo their bodies. Modern people don't. Corbu again. The engineer, inspired by the laws of economy and governed by mathematical calculation, puts us in accord with universal law. So their vision of modern architecture was, it was in harmony with the moral advancement of human society and with the laws of nature. Postmodernism, one of Mies van der Rohe's famous modern slogans was less is more. Robert Venturi, postmodernist, replies, less is a bore. And let me again get I should stay. So, Michael Graves writes, I see architecture not as Gropius did as a moral venture. Gropius created the Bauhaus school and designed the Bauhaus building. But not as truth, but as invention, the same way that poetry or music or painting is invention. And Peter Eisenman, who explores linguistic theories in his architecture, says, this is a Eisenman house, I would never live in anything I design. Architects design houses. I live in a home. So, in its rejection of modernism, postmodernism is still ideological. So what do we have instead? And I think I'm running off the edge here again. No, okay. So during the period of the 1960s, which is a very heady period in contemporary art, it's a period of, I almost say it as one word, Stella, Koons, and Judd, who were the dominant artists of the mid-60s into the 70s. And the dominant critic of the time was Clement Greenberg. And a more recent artist who came roaring onto the scene in the 1980s is Julian Schnabel. And somebody asked Schnabel, how do you see your work in relationship to Clement Greenberg's notion of color field painting and post-painterly abstraction? And Julian Schnabel says, I don't think we talk that way anymore. So how do we talk? And we turn to who's the dominant contemporary architect? Bilbao Museum, Frank Gehry, who says, let the experience begin. So Gehry's a Canadian-born, this is real annoying that it resized all my type. Frank Gehry is now 90 years old, but he did the Bilbao Museum. And interestingly, we're in a more global world today, but in the 1920s through the 60s, you had to be careful about your geographic choices. So when I was in school, California architects were not in the textbooks. There's a special book, 5 California Architects. But they didn't make it into the textbooks. LA was not taken seriously. Well, Frank Gehry made himself an LA architect. And here's some launching his career, his own house, a lifeguard stand, Loyola Law School, and Chat Day advertising agency. So he begins with his own house. It's an existing house, and he makes these additions out of corrugated metal, bare plywood, cyclone fencing, just hanging out. And interestingly, we saw him at the time in the 70s as an architect's architect. So he'll never be popular, but we architects really appreciate him. So when I would go to LA, I'd call the office and the secretary would have a mimeographed, sheet of the recent work of the office and read off the addresses and directions how to get there for architects to go see it. This is a home he did for a retired lifeguard. So he can still be in his little lifeguard stand. This is lots of angles and colors. like a law school. Who does this remind us of? Who? Yeah, but what artist? So my favorite pop artist, of course, Andy Warhol is the greatest, but I actually did some work for, made some stuff for so Oldenburg makes big stuff. Like there's a, does anybody know what that's called? The thing, what's it called? Shuttlecock for badminton. Here's a bow and arrow. Here's a rubber stamp. Here's a saw. I made the soft version of the three-way plug for Oldenburg. It's in front of the Philadelphia Museum, or back of it actually. Here's a ice bag. Here's a spoon with a cherry. Now this is clothespin. There's a giant one in Philadelphia. Let's see. So anyway, those binoculars sort of remind us of Oldenburg. So here is the giant clothespin in Corten steel in front of City Hall in Philadelphia. And one more. It's real cool. Let's see if I can find it. So he proposes a huge cube of concrete at the intersection of Broadway and Canal. It's just like a comment on New York City traffic jams. So let's finish up the architecture, and then we'll take a break here. So here is Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. Here's Zaha Hadid, who died on us just a few months ago. Just the two. Now, there was for a while, Peggy Guggenheim has a museum in Venice, which is sort of run by the Guggenheim. And there was a small Guggenheim in Las Vegas. I think that's not there anymore. It's a gallery, but it's no longer them. And they were going to build a huge Frank Gehry off the Southport Seaport in downtown Manhattan, off of Wall Street. And their director was a guy named Hines, who had a very aggressive vision. And there was a guy named Miller who put up the money. And Miller finally said, I'm not paying for any more of this stuff. But Miller had a series of prominent architects build buildings in Columbus, Indiana. So there's really cool stuff. So Zaha Hadid launched her career with this fire station. Here's her apartment in west side of Manhattan in the 20s. And what's this? The High Line. So one of the architects of the High Line is Elizabeth Diller, Diller and Scofidio. What's now Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. So a little bit of thought about how to launch your career. In my day, you had to really work with the establishment. I got out of school, and I went to work for prominent architects, worked on important projects, and then did my stuff. But you needed to do that. Diller wasn't even an architect. She studied art at Cooper Union. She got involved with her teacher, Scofidio, and they opened a firm, and their first major project was a building made out of steam. So this is for an art expo in Switzerland, and they pump water out of the lake and vaporize it. And that brought her to prominence. She got commission on the High Line. And then they got a $2 billion commission to renovate, modernize Lincoln Center. And did a beautiful job, particularly opening up the corner of the Juilliard School. So you're invited into all that glass. And then most recently, her project, The Shed, just opened. So this is Hudson Yards. It's the west side of Manhattan between 10th Avenue and the Hudson River. It was all railroad tracks. And they decked it over, put up a dozen high-rise buildings. And this is a performance space with this big cover that can slide off, making a big empty space, inviting stuff to happen. So, winding up, this is the Bird's Nest Stadium for the Olympics in Beijing. And this, the other building, is Louis Kahn's Campbell Art Museum. And I was brought up in this tradition of this is structure, structure's concrete, this is travertine infill, not structural, this is a band of glass telling us that this is not supporting this. And we've got a clear grid. This is a very functional stadium, lots of ramps, seating inside, and this has absolutely no purpose whatsoever. It's just applied to look good. So you can think about what you think about that. So any questions about contemporary art and architecture? So let's take a 15-minute break, come back at 20 after, and we'll look at what will be the new art. So what will be the new art? Or, since I'm arguing that art grows out of its culture, creativity grows out of its culture, what will be the new culture, the new world? So there's a quote from the mythologist Joseph Campbell, favorite figure of mine, who says, I'm often asked what will be the new mythology. You cannot say any more than you can say what will be tonight's dream, because they both come from the same realm. So we can't say what will be new art, but maybe we can say what will be its context. And I'm going to look at a Hindu myth called Indras Net. So Indra's a Hindu god. He's king of the gods. He's the equivalent of, say, Zeus for the Greeks. And there's a great net hanging in his palace. It's a chandelier. And at every intersection of the net is a crystal. And every crystal reflects all the other crystals. So that means if you go up to this crystal, you'll see all the other crystals. And in each of the crystals that you're seeing in here will be all the other crystals. And then if you zoom in, etc. So when we look at quantum physics, our world's starting to look like that. Of course, one has to pick and choose, but you can find a lot in Hindu mythology that parallels a lot of the way we see the world today. And I would, if you look at the biblical traditions, they're very restricted. It's like they're in this little valley with a dome over it. If you look at India, they're very comfortable with infinities. They talk about yugas, which are hundreds of thousands of years. And, they're comfortable with these vast spaces and times. So, for example, if both Hinduism and Buddhism is they don't make sense unless you believe in reincarnation. So, if the population keeps growing, where would one reincarnate from? And their attitude is there's an infinity of beings. There's billions of beings in your fingernail. There's billions of planets with billions of beings. There's plenty of creatures to reincarnate. So we looked a couple of times at Newton's Clockwork Universe, and we see the kind of mechanistic quality of perspective. You stand in a certain spot, and the space and time around you is generated by your position. Newton could calculate the motions of the planets. Then we go to the 19th century, and we see these fields where you don't have space with objects in the space, but rather you have fields in flux, and what we would call objects are vortices, the twirling vortices in the fields. And in the 20th century, we have relativity, in which the position and motion of the observer changes what's observed. So what about our world today? And our first temptation might be to look at technology, and I'm certainly into technology. And we could look at, well, what are advanced computers going to do? What happens when we start manipulating DNA? What's going to be the impact of robotics? Will we be getting around with black hole rapid transit systems? And somebody addressing all this is Ray Kurzweil in this terrific book, The Singularity is Near. And Kurzweil starts with the premise of what's called Moore's Law. Anybody tell me what Moore's Law is? Okay. Moore's Law is stated very roughly and generally. The capability of computers doubles every 2 years.
What was that?
The capability of computers doubles every 2 years. Now, actually, Moore's Law says that the number of transistors that you can get on a single chip at the same price doubles every 2 years. And but we can generalize it to say, because also the capacity of the hard disk doubles. I mean, the stupid thing is 128 gigabytes. My first one was half a megabyte. And just every year they double. So we could get hung up in that, and certainly there's going to be an impact of that. And one of the importances, if you look at what Mark Zuckerberg did with Facebook, everything he did, AOL had years before he did. Now, why didn't AOL become Facebook? Why did AOL disappear? And partially, it's mostly because AOL didn't have the vision, and Zuckerberg did. But it's also partially because when Zuckerberg was trying to do what he wanted to do was just when computers became powerful enough to do that. So 2 years earlier, it couldn't have been done. 2 years later, someone else would have done it. So if you look at Google, Facebook, Apple, every one of them are very affected by timing. And so Ray Kurzweil talks about that. He says, what's going to be the hot technology 10 years from now? It's well simple. You plot out how powerful computers are going to be, knowing that they double in capability every 2 years. How powerful will they be in 10 years? With that amount of power, what can you do? When can they do when can they do facial recognition? When can they do translate languages? When can they, etc. And he started writing this in the 80s and predicted all this. But instead, let's look at the culture of science and look at three things: quantum entanglement, symbiogenesis, and genomics. And I'll jump ahead because I'm going to repeat these. So quantum entanglement we associate with Bell's theorem. Now, this dates back to 1934, something that Einstein did with two colleagues. But essentially what they said was, if two particles encounter each other and you then separate them, what you do to this particle will affect that particle instantly, even if it's across the universe, faster than the speed of light. But you can't use it to communicate. It's very complicated. But what it says is that the universe is entangled. Things are tied to each other. There's a famous poetic phrase, pick a flower and disturb the furthest star. Anything you do reverberates and affects. Anybody know the equivalent expression in chaos theory? A butterfly flapping its wings in Beijing today will cause a hurricane next month in New Orleans. So what chaos theory tells us is that extremely small effects can have extremely large consequences. Well, Einstein, it's called the EPR paradox, people were struggling with it, and finally in 1964, John Bell, who died kind of young, said, I gotta sit down and work this out. And he did, and it gave us quantum entanglement. Particles reflect each other across the universe, or stated another way, existence is made up of relationships rather than of space-time and causality. All is Indras Net. So what I like to do is, I see something like that and I say, does that have implications for other things? So this is Lynn Margulies. She was married for a while to the cosmologist Carl Sagan, who's very famous, did a famous TV series. And she's a biologist, or was, died a few years ago. And she puts forward a theory that she calls symbiogenesis. Now, it's known that bacteria and viruses can move around DNA. So, for example, we have some cat DNA in us. Some point in our history, some virus moved DNA from cats to people. So there's this big jumble. And every cell in every plant and every animal, every cell in every animal, has things in them called mitochondria. And they're little clumps in the cell that make all the energy of the cell. And they have their own DNA. They do not share our quote-unquote DNA. And the mitochondria are inherited directly from the mother. So the DNA in the nucleus of every cell comes half from your mother and half from your father. The mitochondria just get cloned from your mother. These mitochondria, it's generally now accepted, were their own organisms, and they got hijacked into animal cells. And so they're sort of like parasites, or well, but they have a symbiogenic relationship. So parasites are negative. So Lynn Margulies starts with that, and she's one of the first people to propose that. But she goes on to say, all of evolution comes from not from Darwinian natural selection. So Darwin said, in every litter, there's going to be variation. And let's say it's dogs. Some of the pups are going to be better suited to survive than others. And their characteristics will get passed on. And eventually, over long periods of time, you get evolutionary change from that. Well, Darwin didn't know two things. He didn't know about Mendelian genetics, which he should have, because Mendel sent him his paper. And he didn't know about mutations. That was understood later. So mutation speeds up Darwinian evolution. But Lynn Margulies says, no, that's not how it works. What happens is whole genomes are getting moved around wholesale. Every time you sneeze, you're blowing out all this DNA. Now, we know that viruses, the way they work, is they go into cells and hijack. The viruses cannot reproduce on their own. They hijack the nucleus of a cell and force it to make more viruses. But also, we're coming to understand that this is the number of genes human beings have. This is the number of genes in the bacteria and viruses in our bodies. 90% of the DNA that we've got isn't our DNA. It's bacteria DNA. This is Pigpen from a Peanuts cartoon. And we're blowing it all around. So that we had, before Darwin, we came to think of creatures as discrete. Okay, so there's lions and tigers and panthers and domestic cats and elephants and gorillas and human beings, all these different species. And the Bible is attached to that notion. But what we understand with Darwinian evolution, and even more so with the Margulies symbiogenesis, is that it's all a continuity. So what we call tigers are a temporary gathering of DNA in creatures that can reproduce, that in the past, that DNA was different, and in the future, it'll be different. Friedrich Nietzsche, excuse me, has a very strong sense of that about human beings. We're not it. We're just part of the path. We're part of something that's going to be something very different in the future. And I like to remind us that don't get attached to this. This is not going to look at all like this in 10 years. This is going to be something totally different. We tend to think, oh, this is it, you know, but this wasn't even around 15 years ago. And whatever it is in 10 years from now, it's going to be totally different. So what does symbiogenesis tell us? That life forms that once seemed discrete are totally interconnected, continually exchanging DNA. All is Indras Net. Genomics. Now, this is Watson and Crick. 1953, they deciphered the structure of DNA. So DNA was known about. DNA was this stuff, they understood it chemically but not structurally. And it was the stuff in the nucleus of the cell. And some people thought it was the mechanism for inheritance. But that didn't seem right, because there are only four things in DNA. There's adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. How can 4 molecules do all the complexity of inheritance? What's a parallel example that makes it clear? How many letters in the alphabet?
26.
How many?
26.
26. I never know. It's 24, 26. 26 letters. And maybe you triple that. You have capitals, lowercase, and italics, and a few punctuations. So, okay, say 100. With 100 letters, what can you do? Everything that's ever been done. Everything that's ever been written. Anything you can describe in words, you can describe with 26 letters. And what if you change those letters to Morse code? 2. Dot and dash. With a dot and dash, you can write all the world's literature. Everything that's ever been written. Every instruction manual. All of human knowledge can be done with dot and dash, or ones and zeros. All that's in there is ones and zeros. All those images. Everything that you can get on Wikipedia, everything you get, it's all ones and zeros. So you only need 2. DNA uses 4. So Watson and Crick figured out the structure of the DNA molecule, which was the double helix. And that's how reproduction works. There's 4 letters, 2 rules. Guanine and cytosine can link. Adenine and thymine can link. That's it. 4 letters, 2 rules. You make all of life. So they link, and this is a backward version of this. And they pull apart. Each can recreate the other, and that's how reproduction takes place. That's how a cell can divide. So here are these simple rules that can make all of life. Now, Watson's pretty old. Crick died. Watson's pretty old. But a few years ago, he wrote a book called DNA, which is, if you're interested, it's a really good summary of the story. Well, here's one of my favorite figures, Stephen Wolfram. And Wolfram works with cellular automata. So you make what, there are 8 of these. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. And this is a rule that says if you have 3 white squares, the square below will be white. If you have black, white, white, the center square below will be black. So black, white, white, and this below this one is black. So with these rules, you'll make this design. Now, there are 256 different possible ways to arrange this. And they make these different patterns. How much complexity can we make from a set of simple rules? So who knows what this is? Right, it's a Mandelbrot set, which is a particular kind of fractal. So just to remind everybody, let's just go to Google Image. So fractals were all the rage about 30 years ago, and these beautiful color books came out filled with fractals. And so these are all fractals. And then Hollywood discovered them and said, if we make special effects software that we use for our movies, and we make at the core of the software, we make it fractals, we make something like, say, mountains, they look really realistic. There's a reason for that. Nature's using fractals. Nature's using rules like fractals to make mountains. So when you make mountains for a movie with fractal generating software, lightning is fractals. So fractals are self-similar. So a good example is broccoli. Let's do a fern. No, let's do a fern. So this thing is similar to this thing, is similar to this thing, etc. As you zoom in, you keep getting detail which is similar to the detail you saw at a larger scale. One of the most famous fractals, now the inventor of fractals is a mathematician named Mandelbrot, died a few years ago. And the art and architecture students really got into his course at Yale. It was really popular. So he made a not too complicated a formula, a recursive set, that makes what's called a Mandelbrot set. Now, if you solve this formula, it generates a position on the graph paper and you put a dot. You solve it again, you make another dot, and eventually you can make this a lot of work. Boy, were they happy when computers came along. So the computers can churn this out. And as you zoom in on a Mandelbrot set, you keep seeing detail. These look like little Mandelbrot sets. So you zoom in on these guys, and in here are little Mandelbrot sets. They're somewhat a little bit different from the original one, but they're similar idea. And we zoom in some more, and way in the center of these are little Mandelbrot sets. And we zoom in some more, and we zoom in some more, and literally, you can zoom in infinitely. The only limitation is how much computer power you want to throw at it. Well, they have now zoomed in so far that the outer Mandelbrot set, if it were on a drawing, is bigger than the known universe. That's how far they've zoomed in, and they keep getting these patterns. They're kind of Paisley patterns. So, simple, could it be that the mechanistic Clockwork Universe of Newton that gave us perspective painting, the fields of Clark Maxwell that gave us those swirling, I'm contending, those swirling paintings of Van Gogh, the relativity of Einstein that gave us cubism. Could it be that creativity will take place today within a world made out of simple rules? This is Carl Schuh, used to teach at Pratt. He would give his students 3 genes, A, B, and C. By the end of the semester, the building has grown itself. So what do DNA and so this idea I like to call genomics. Let me see what I got coming up here. Yeah, okay, good. So what do DNA and genomics tell us? Genomics being building from simple rule sets. That simple rules can build the rich universe in which we live, and that the outcomes of these rules are regulated by as yet not fully understood principles. Stephen Wolfram likes to say, I think when I find the code that generates our universe, it'll be about 6 lines. He thinks 6 lines of code, just the way this simple formula can make this infinitely complex Mandelbrot set, 6 lines of code can make our whole universe. So he keeps adding more and more servers and computer power to the basement. He has a company that makes Wolfram Alpha and makes Mathematica that all scientists use. It's the software they use. And he spends all the money adding computers, so he's trying to find a set of code that will generate the universe. So, what do entanglement, symbiogenesis, and genomics taken together tell us? That the world is made up of self-computing entities that build themselves and the world from simple rules, and all is interconnected. All is Indras Net. So what might we make of this? First of all, here's a metaphor that might help us. So, to simplify, we can call this Seurat's Sunday in the Park. And what am I going to show you next? What have we been doing? Zooming in. What happens when you zoom in? It's called pointillism. So these figures look very classical, but when we zoom in, it's all just dots. The world and we are made of self-computing networks built from simple rules. And we're blowing it all around and exchanging it. My wife's an opera singer. She says, you better not come home with a cold. So let's see if we can build a world from simple rules. This is John Conway's Game of Life. So in the 70s, Conway devised the notion that you take a checkerboard, all white squares. You do 2 things. You make you make some of the squares black. That's initial condition. Which ones you make black is important. And then you make rules. And the rules can be if a square is surrounded by 3 or more if a black square is surrounded by 3 or more black squares, it will die of suffocation. So in the next iteration, it'll be white. If it is surrounded by 2 or less black squares, it'll die of loneliness. If it is surrounded by 3 or more 3 squares, it'll reproduce. So then as we go through iterations, it keeps changing. And the most common thing that it does is it looks like a petri dish. Anybody grow bacteria in a petri dish in biology class? So you get this little dish of nutrient, and you put bacteria on it, and it grows, and then it starts dying off because it crowds itself out. It's drowning in its waste. It's using up all the nutrients. But you can make a game of life that exactly reproduces that. That's the rules that the bacteria are playing by. Now, these are called gliders. It's called a glider gun. These are called gliders. So they've made thousands of different things, including they've been able to make a computer out of these Conway's Game of Life thingies. But what I'm interested in is, I said, Carl Schur gives his students 3 genes and the building makes itself. So let's jump ahead. If you wanted to make an oak tree, you would not stick a pole in the ground, nail sticks to the pole, and glue leaves to the pole. What would you do? Plant an acorn. Let the stupid oak tree make itself. How many people here have made something as that complicated as an oak tree?
Like planted something?
Every one of you made yourself. You started off as one set of genes in one cell. And you now got and what's this called? Okay. The most complicated thing in the universe. I don't, it's a stupid statement, but the human brain is called, every one of you made a human brain, which is called the most complicated thing in the universe. If you can make human beings, why aren't we making our cell phones that way? Why have all these people with tweezers putting them together? Let the stupid things make themselves. Oak trees can make themselves. Human beings can make themselves. Why can't the stupid cell phone make itself?
Well, it's like saying, why can't we get a shirt to make a shirt, right?
Right. You would have to make the shirt have that built in. Human beings, now, if you think about DNA, how does reproduction work? And one of the theories before modern genetics was the homunculus theory. In the sperm, or the egg, but of course since men are saying that the egg is simply the food, the sperm is the real thing. In the sperm is a little man. Because where would all this come from? How does it know? They're all there in the sperm. Now here's what's the problem with that. That sperm would have to have testicles. In those testicles would be, that homunculus would have testicles. In those testicles would be sperm. In those sperm would be yet smaller homunculuses. In that, and when you run out, the human, everybody will disappear. How many are there? How long can we keep reproducing before we run out of the little guys in there? Well, it looks like it's indefinite, so that's not a good theory. So what is the theory? Well, Erwin Schrödinger, one of the pioneers of quantum theory in the 1940s, wrote a beautiful little book called What is Life? And he figured out what it would have to do. It's a non-periodic crystal that can self-reproduce. He described DNA, figured the whole thing out, what it would have to be. And Watson and Crick and everybody else read that book. And Watson and Crick were in a race with the greatest chemist of all time, the only winner of 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. I'm not thinking of his name. But they were in a race, and they said, we don't have a chance. This is the most brilliant guy on the planet. And they beat him. He got hung up thinking it was a triple helix, and it screwed him up. You want to look it up?
What's his name?
Nobel Prize physicist. Here, let me do it. I'm sorry, chemist. Get up to, he just died a few years ago. Oh, this is not in order. But he pioneered quantum chemistry. This is only giving us one. Okay. Let's do this. Okay, cut it out.
Franklin?
No, she's the one who did the X-rays that Watson and Crick stole. So everybody felt she should have gotten the Nobel Prize with them. But it's a moot point because she died.
Not Marie Curie.
Well, no, Marie Curie was chosen as the greatest, but that's not who I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of a contemporary. Just died a few years ago. So,
Rosalind Franklin?
No, she worked on the DNA race.
Oh.
Because she died too young to be. Now, can that be done? Well, obviously it can be done. We make oak trees and human beings every day. But let's see if we could do it in the factory. So let's go here. So, this arrangement, following these rules about when to reproduce and when to die off, is now most arrangements simply very quickly go all white or go all black. Or they do something for a while and then they go all white or all black. But this arrangement is manufacturing these guys. Now there are two things we want to add. We want to get it in 3 dimensions, and then what's the hard part? We want to get it out of the computer and make it happen in the real world. IBM's already making chips that way, self-replicating chips. So they're looking for self-organizing materials that will fabricate themselves. Let's just try something. Self-organization. So crystals can grow themselves. Can we make complex things that can grow themselves? So my contention is that the dominant technological background of our time that's going to, within which contemporary creativity will take place, will be this self-organization in which complex things are generated from simple rules. Oak trees do it all the time, human beings do it all the time, and I'm suggesting we should eventually be making our cell phones that way. And again, let me apologize for my type getting too big. Today, the world and we are made of self-computing networks built from simple rules. So just the way Zuckerberg had an instinct for understanding things as networks. And there's all these companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, are competing for the most brilliant scientists on the planet and have them working on things like network theory. Understand what's going on. To give you an example, anybody watch Silicon Valley? It's a lot of fun. And if you've got Netflix or something like that where you can go see the original ones, it's about some nerds. And they do really good classic sitcom comedy, but it's about Silicon Valley. And this guy has started some type of picture sharing social network. And he's looking for funding. Well, he's developed an algorithm to compress the pictures. That's the single most valuable thing in all of computer science. It's becoming less important as we move to 5G and you can download a high-def movie in 5 seconds. But it used to take 5 hours. And if we could compress the movie and get it to load quicker, that's the golden whatever. That's the gold ring. That's the great discovery. So this guy's trying to launch his social network. Everybody says, "You idiot! You've got the most brilliant compression algorithm ever thought. Everybody's going to want it." So these companies are looking for, like, if somebody can understand networks to know, I know you, you know her, you know him, you know her, you know, and what that means, how we can relate, how it can be, show us what we want to see on our Facebook page in a way we're not seeing it now, that would be the next unicorn. Who can tell me what a unicorn is? It's a new tech company that hasn't gone public yet that's worth over $1 billion. So that would be the next hot thing. So these are the kinds of, this is the world that these people are living in. I think it's more than just technology. I think that's how our art and creativity is going to be working. Visionary creatives swim in the culture of our day. The things they create. In art, architecture, science, technology, business, embody our culture and at the same time pull us into the future. Okay, next week I want to talk about destruction. So there's one more thing that I could put off, but it's not that long. So it's a real pretty story. Have you noticed that I sort of talk about tech a bit? So let's look at that and see what we think about it. And let me contrast two different worlds. So this is timeshare. I'm director of research. Our clients have spent over $100 million to identify the genetic cause of aging and turn it off. This is 2045, group of Russian oligarchs who are developing avatars into which to download themselves to achieve immortality. This is a guy named Seth Lloyd. He's at MIT. And he believes the universe is a program, like, simple rules make the complex universe. And he wants to reprogram it. So this is a book on reprogramming the universe. And this is Ray Kurzweil, a leading futurist. And if anybody's nervous about Ray Kurzweil, you can get more nervous because he just became chief scientist at Google, so he has unlimited resources. So in his book, The Singularity is Near, he writes, may only take a quarter of a millennium, that's 250 years, to go from sending messages on horseback. Frank Lloyd Wright was born the same year they completed the transatlantic cable. Before that, you send a message to London, 6 weeks. The answer comes back, 6 weeks. The moment they had the transatlantic cable, telegraph instant. Totally changed the world. Only 250 years from sending messages on horseback or sailboat to saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. We're putting satellites all over the solar system, but they're these huge things that weigh tons. So the hot computer in the 80s, Seymour Cray, made the fastest computers. He's long since died, but this is more powerful than a Cray 1 computer. And a Cray 1 computer is about the size of this room. So they're getting smaller. So what happens when those communication satellites are the size of peas? We send one launch, we could send up 10,000 of them. And they could all be communicating with each other to put together the larger picture of whatever their sensors are looking at. Saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. We're just starting to do that. And the ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence will then require moving out into the rest of the universe, where we may engineer new universes. We know how to make a universe. It just takes a lot of energy. You'd have to get into the center of a galaxy, use high energy X-rays to bombard a star to turn it into supernova, to get a supernova chain reaction, to get the kind of energy you need. But they're working on it. Here's another point of view. This is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. How many people have read the Tao Te Ching? Hello, we have some Asians here. This is the fundamental book. So I like the translation by Fwang in English. Do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you will ruin it. So, two very different attitudes. So let's look at actually, let me grab something else. I have the short version here, and the longer version is kind of fun. So let me grab it. Hang on. Yeah, hang on. AT&T's telling me it's a junk call. Let's go to So here are these two different points of view, and let's see them embodied in some people. So this is a beautiful little book called The Starship and the Canoe. And it's about father and son Dyson. So this is Freeman Dyson. He, for some years, had Einstein's chair at Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, and he worked on some big projects. One of them was Orion, a Navy project to explode atomic bombs under a spaceship to propel it. So you have a few dozen atomic bombs in the ship, eject them out, set them off, and it pushes it along. And they were working on building it, and then John F. Kennedy signed the Nuclear Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty. You can't blow up atom bombs in the air anymore. And so the project got shelved and we built chemical rockets instead. But this is kind of, and then later he worked on using hydrogen bombs so you could get to other galaxies at decent speeds. This is what's called a Dyson sphere. If we look at the sun is here, the earth is here, 99.99% of the energy of the sun does not reach the earth. It's going in all directions. Well, at some point in the future, we're going to need that energy as we get into more civilization computation. Dyson is designed, you can take a planet like Jupiter, dismantle it, and make a sphere the size of the Earth's orbit surrounding the sun. And that way you capture all the energy. That's called a Dyson sphere. And then in our solar system, there's only 8 or 9 planets, but there's millions of comets. So he's been working on designing trees that can grow on comets. And you could populate millions of comets with these Dyson trees. So that's what Freeman Dyson, while he's working on that, his dropout hippie son is trying to keep the flying squirrels out of his treehouse in Vancouver. And the two of them are not getting along. And they're going to have a reunion. Freeman Dyson's going to come visit George Dyson, his son. His son's now a prominent scientific journalist, writes about history of computers. But the two are going to get together. George had been building a giant ocean-going kayak, and Brower joined the family reunion and wrote this book about it. Here's the Orion being propelled by atomic energy, atomic bomb explosions. Here's George Dyson in his kayak. And the two got together, and they had a very successful reunion. And sometime later, Freeman Dyson had a dream that instead of building atomic and hydrogen bomb-powered starships, to build solar wind-powered starships. So these giant sails catch the pressure of the solar wind from the sun and propel them. He dreamt he was on one and it was being navigated by his son. So the Buddha says our universe is the field of the intertwined minds of all beings. Sort of like Indras Net. Moving away from Newton's Clockwork Universe, the English physicist James Jeans says, the universe begins to look more like a giant thought than a giant machine. We may someday travel to the stars, or we may find through quantum entanglement that we are already there. We may reprogram the universe, or we may find new inner worlds. We may extend our physical lives to centuries through the manipulation of DNA, or we may find that we value a life like a work of art, not by its length, but by its luminosity. Neuroscience may find pathways to inner harmony, or we may realize that ancient disciplines found those pathways long ago. We await our creatives.